It started with a box. Laura had been unpacking her belongings after moving into a new apartment, a small sunlit space in an old brownstone building on the quieter side of the city. The move was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to leave behind everything that had weighed her down over the years. But as she opened one of the last boxes, tucked away in the back of her closet, her breath caught. Inside were things she hadn't seen in years: a cracked wristwatch, a battered copy of Moby Dick, a copper keychain shaped like an owl, and a silver spoon engraved with Semiramis 1921. They were all his, Miles's. She hadn't thought about him in so long that it felt strange to hold these objects now, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Their breakup had been quiet, almost anticlimactic. No shouting matches, no dramatic exits, just two people who drifted apart until there was nothing left to say. Yet here he was, or at least pieces of him, packed away and forgotten. Taped to the lid of the box was a yellowed note in Miles's unmistakable handwriting. "Return it if you find the time." She laughed softly at the irony. Miles had always been obsessed with time, how it moved, how it shaped people's lives, how it could be bent or manipulated through memories and emotions. He used to talk about it endlessly during their late-night conversations, but Laura had never taken him seriously. To her, it had always seemed like one of his eccentric quirks. She debated what to do with the box. Throwing it out felt wrong, too final, too cruel. But keeping it didn't feel right either. After some deliberation, she decided she would return the items to him. It wasn't about rekindling anything. It was about closure. She would drop them off and move on with her life. The first item she chose to return was the silver spoon. It seemed harmless enough, a trinket from some antique shop Miles had dragged her into years ago during one of their road trips. She remembered how he'd held it up to the light and marveled at its craftsmanship, claiming it must have belonged to someone important. Laura had rolled her eyes at the time but let him buy it anyway. She took the spoon to an antique shop on Baker Street, thinking Miles might appreciate its historical value more than she ever could. The shopkeeper was an elderly man with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He examined the spoon carefully before nodding. "A fine piece," he said in a gravelly voice. "Strange that you'd part with it." "It's not mine," Laura replied quickly. "I'm just returning it." The man gave her an odd smile but said nothing more as he wrapped the spoon in brown paper and placed it behind the counter. Laura left feeling lighter, as though she'd taken a small step toward letting go of her past. But that night something changed. Laura woke abruptly at midnight, her heart pounding for no apparent reason. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the cuckoo clock on her wall, a gift from Miles on their engagement day. She glanced at it groggily and froze. The clock was striking 13 times. She stared at it in disbelief as the tiny wooden bird emerged from its door over and over again, each chime louder than the last. When it finally stopped, Laura noticed something else: a sharp pain in her temple and an odd sensation on her wrist. She stumbled to the bathroom mirror and gasped. A streak of gray ran through her dark hair near her right temple, something that hadn't been there before she went to bed. On her wrist was what looked like a digital tattoo glowing faintly in red. -365. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of dream? A stress-induced hallucination? But no matter how many times she splashed water on her face or pinched herself, nothing changed. The next morning, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She returned to Baker Street to confront the shopkeeper about the spoon, but when she arrived, he greeted her with an unsettling smile. "Back so soon?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "What did you do with that spoon?" Laura demanded. "I sold it," he replied simply. "Why? Feeling its weight already?" "What does that mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. The man leaned forward slightly over the counter, his eyes narrowing as though he could see straight into her soul. "Objects carry echoes," he said cryptically. "Memories aren't just thoughts, they're energy, and energy doesn't just disappear." Laura felt a chill run down her spine as his words sank in. Could this really be happening? Was there something about those items, about Miles, that tied them to her more deeply than she'd ever realized? She left the shop without another word and hurried home, desperate for answers but unsure where to start looking. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment surrounded by Miles's belongings, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her somehow, waiting for something. The cuckoo clock ticked steadily on the wall behind her, its presence suddenly oppressive rather than comforting. Laura thought back to all those conversations with Miles about time and how he believed memories could shape reality if given enough focus and intent. At the time, she'd dismissed his ideas as harmless ramblings from a man who read too much science fiction. But now she wasn't so sure. The next morning, fueled by a potent mix of fear and determination, Laura began researching everything she could find about chronomancy, time magic, and the occult. She spent hours poring over dusty books in the local library, scrolling through obscure websites, and even venturing into online forums dedicated to paranormal phenomena. Most of it was nonsense, conspiracy theories and fantastical claims that she quickly dismissed. But buried within the noise were a few intriguing nuggets of information. She discovered ancient texts that spoke of objects imbued with temporal energy, artifacts that could store, manipulate, and even steal time. These objects, often created during periods of intense emotion or trauma, were said to act as conduits between the past, present, and future. The key, it seemed, was the emotional connection between the object and the person who possessed it. Laura remembered a specific conversation she'd had with Miles about a legendary grimoire known as the Chronicon Temporum. It was said to contain rituals for binding time to physical objects and bending reality to one's will. Miles had dismissed it as folklore, but now she wondered if he knew more than he had let on. As she delved deeper into her research, Laura began to understand the mechanics of what was happening to her. The silver spoon, a seemingly innocuous object, had acted as a trigger, opening a temporal rift that allowed time to drain from her and transfer to the cuckoo clock. The clock, in turn, was somehow connected to Miles, acting as a temporal anchor that kept the process going. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Miles had always been fascinated by clocks, collecting them from flea markets and antique stores. He had a particular fondness for cuckoo clocks, drawn to their intricate mechanisms and the way they marked the passage of time. The clock he'd given her on their engagement day had been his prized possession, a vintage Black Forest clock with hand-carved details and a hauntingly melodic chime. Laura suddenly remembered something else, a story Miles had once told her about his great-grandfather, a clockmaker who was rumored to have dabbled in the occult. According to family lore, the clockmaker had discovered a way to trap time within his creations, granting them an unnaturally long lifespan. Could Miles have inherited this knowledge? Was he using the clock to manipulate time for his own purposes? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had always believed Miles was a harmless eccentric, but what if she had been wrong? What if there was a darker side to him that she had never seen? Fueled by this new understanding, Laura decided to confront Miles directly. She tracked him down through social media and sent him a message, demanding to know what was going on. To her surprise, he responded almost immediately, agreeing to meet her at a coffee shop near his apartment. When she arrived, Miles looked different, older somehow. His eyes, once filled with youthful enthusiasm, now held a haunted quality. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with a silver ring on his finger as he spoke. "Laura," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually." "Figure what out, Miles?" she snapped. "That you're stealing my time with some crazy clock?" Miles sighed and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not that simple, Laura. It's complicated." He explained that he had indeed inherited his great-grandfather's knowledge of temporal magic, but he insisted that he hadn't intended to harm her. The clock, he claimed, was merely a conduit for his own experiments with time, a way to slow down the aging process and prolong his life. The objects he'd left behind were meant to be returned, completing a circuit that would channel the excess energy back into him. "But why me, Miles?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "Why use me as your battery?" Miles looked down at his hands, shame evident in his eyes. "Because you were the closest person to me, Laura. The connection we shared, it made you the perfect vessel." Laura recoiled in disgust. "So all those years we spent together were just an experiment to you?" Miles looked up, his eyes pleading. "No, Laura, it wasn't like that at all. I truly cared about you. But this is something I had to do." Laura stood up, her anger bubbling to the surface. "You're insane, Miles. I'm not going to let you do this to me. I'm going to stop you no matter what it takes." She turned and stormed out of the coffee shop, leaving Miles alone with his secrets and his clock. Laura knew that she had to find a way to break the connection between herself, Miles, and the temporal artifacts before it was too late. Her life, quite literally, depended on it. Laura's frantic search led her to a hidden community of scholars and mages, concealed within the labyrinthine stacks of the Boston Athenaeum. She had stumbled upon them through a coded message hidden within a footnote of the Chronicon Temporum, a message that spoke of guardians of the weave, individuals dedicated to protecting the delicate balance of time and reality. The guardians, led by a wizened woman named Eleanor, were initially skeptical of Laura's claims. Chronomancy, they explained, was a dangerous art, long forbidden due to its potential to unravel the very fabric of existence. The weave, a mystical energy field that bound all of reality together, was particularly vulnerable to temporal manipulations. "Time is not a river flowing in a single direction," Eleanor said, her voice raspy with age. "It is a tapestry, intricately woven with threads of causality. To tug on one thread is to risk unraveling the entire design." However, after witnessing the digital tattoo on Laura's wrist and the strange fluctuations in her temporal aura, they realized that she was telling the truth. They agreed to help her, but warned that reversing the process would be fraught with peril. "The connection between you and Miles has created a resonance within the weave," Eleanor explained. "To sever that connection, you must unravel the threads that bind you to the clock, to the artifacts, and to him. But be warned, tampering with time always comes at a cost." The Guardians guided Laura through a series of rituals designed to weaken the temporal bond. They used ancient incantations and arcane devices to disrupt the flow of energy between her and the clock, creating pockets of temporal distortion around her. During these rituals, Laura experienced vivid flashes of memories from her past with Miles. Moments of joy, love, and heartbreak, all swirling together in a chaotic vortex. One ritual involved creating a counterspell using personal objects that represented positive moments in her life, untainted by her relationship with Miles. As she held a photograph of her grandmother and a seashell she found on a childhood vacation, she felt a surge of energy coursing through her veins, pushing back against the temporal drain. Meanwhile, Laura continued to investigate Miles's activities. She discovered that he had been experimenting with chronomancy for years, driven by a desperate desire to cheat death and achieve a form of immortality. He had been searching for a way to bank his life force too, storing it in the Cuckoo clock to prolong his existence. His research had led him to a shadowy organization known as the Chronomasters, a group of rogue mages who believed that time was a resource to be exploited for personal gain. They had taught him the forbidden techniques he was now using to steal Laura's time, promising him the key to eternal life. As Laura delved deeper into the conspiracy, she realized that she wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting to protect the weave from being torn apart by the Chronomaster's reckless ambitions. She discovered that Miles was planning a major temporal ritual that would not only steal more of her time but also shatter the barriers between alternate timelines. The ritual was scheduled to take place on the next full moon, at an abandoned observatory on the outskirts of the city. Laura knew that she had to stop him, even if it meant risking everything. With the help of the Guardians, Laura prepared for a final confrontation with Miles. They armed her with a powerful amulet that could disrupt the flow of temporal energy and taught her a counterspell that could sever the connection between her and the clock. As the full moon approached, Laura felt a growing sense of dread. She knew that the fate of her life, and perhaps the fate of the world, hung in the balance. The clock was ticking and time was running out. The abandoned observatory stood on a wind-swept hill overlooking the city, its skeletal dome reaching towards the heavens like a forgotten prayer. It was a place where the veil between worlds seemed thin, where the whispers of the cosmos could be heard on the wind. According to Eleanor, it was also a site of ancient temporal disturbances, a nexus point where the weave was particularly fragile. As Laura and the Guardians approached the observatory under the pale light of the full moon, they could feel the air crackling with temporal energy. The very stones seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly hum. Miles had already arrived, surrounded by a circle of hooded figures, the Chronomasters. They were chanting in a language that sounded both ancient and alien, their voices resonating with a dark, hypnotic power. At the center of the circle, Miles stood before a massive telescope, its lens focused on the moon. He was holding the Cuckoo clock in his hands, its wooden surface glowing with an eerie light. Laura could see the small pendulum swinging back and forth, marking the passage of her stolen time. "Miles, stop!" Laura shouted, her voice echoing across the hilltop. "You don't know what you're doing." Miles turned to face her, his eyes filled with a manic intensity. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Laura. I'm claiming my destiny. I'm going to transcend the limitations of time and become something more." He gestured towards the telescope. "With the power of the Chronomasters and the energy of this clock, I will tear a hole in the fabric of reality and step into a new timeline, a timeline where I am immortal." The Chronomasters intensified their chanting, and the Cuckoo clock began to vibrate violently. The air around Miles shimmered and distorted, and a vortex of temporal energy opened above the telescope, swirling like a miniature black hole. Eleanor stepped forward, her face grim. "This is madness, Miles. You're going to destroy everything." "Silence, old woman," Miles retorted. "You cannot stop me. I am beyond your comprehension." He raised the clock above his head, preparing to unleash its full power. Laura knew that she had to act fast. She charged towards Miles, pushing through the circle of Chronomasters. They tried to stop her, but she dodged their grasp and continued her advance. As she neared Miles, she activated the amulet she wore around her neck. A wave of energy surged from the amulet, disrupting the flow of temporal energy around the clock. The vortex above the telescope flickered and shrank, its power momentarily diminished. Miles staggered backward, clutching the clock to his chest. "What have you done?" he gasped. "I'm stopping you, Miles," Laura said, her voice firm. "I'm taking back what's mine." She reached out and grabbed the Cuckoo clock from his hands. As her fingers touched the wooden surface, she felt a surge of energy pass through her body. Visions flooded her mind. Memories of her life with Miles, moments of joy and sorrow, all swirling together in a dizzying chaos. She could feel the clock pulling her back in time, trying to drag her into the vortex. But she held on tight, focusing all her will on breaking the connection between herself and the artifact. With a final surge of energy, she unleashed the counterspell that the Guardians had taught her. The words of the incantation resonated with power, disrupting the temporal field around the clock. The pendulum stopped swinging, and the wooden surface began to crack. The vortex above the telescope imploded with a deafening roar, sending shockwaves of energy through the observatory. The Chronomasters screamed as their bodies began to age rapidly, their skin withering and their bones turning to dust. Miles collapsed to the ground, his face contorted with pain. The Cuckoo clock shattered into 1,000 pieces, its temporal energy dissipating into the night air. With the Cuckoo clock shattered and the Chronomasters vanquished, or rather aged into dust, Laura thought the nightmare was over. She was wrong. The disruption of temporal energy had created ripples in the weave, causing localized time distortions. Objects flickered in and out of existence, memories shifted and blurred, and strange temporal anomalies began to manifest throughout the city. As cited in the World Anvil Entry 1, improper wielding of time magic carries serious consequences. One morning, Laura woke up to find her apartment transformed into a Victorian-era parlor, complete with antique furniture and gas lamps. The next day, it was a futuristic space station filled with holographic displays and anti-gravity devices. She was experiencing multi-chronal existence too, existing across multiple points in time simultaneously. The Guardians explained that the shattered clock had released a surge of unstable temporal energy, creating time knots, eddies in the stream of time that disrupted its flow within a certain area. These knots were capable of altering causality, causing objects and people to become trapped in repeating time loops or to be transported to different time periods too. Eleanor warned that if the time knots weren't contained, they could merge and create a Dragon Break 2 - a catastrophic event that would shatter linear time and plunge the world into chaos. The most prominent Dragon Break, the Middle Dawn, resulted in 1,000 years of non-linear time too, something they desperately needed to avoid. To make matters worse, the shattered pieces of the Cuckoo clock had become imbued with temporal energy, turning them into miniature time bombs. Anyone who came into contact with the fragments would be subjected to unpredictable temporal effects, such as accelerated aging, memory loss, or even spontaneous time travel. Laura and the Guardians embarked on a perilous quest to retrieve the fragments and contain the time knots. They traveled to different locations throughout the city, each one affected by a unique temporal anomaly. At a local park, they encountered a group of children playing in a perpetual time loop, reliving the same moment over and over again. They were forced to use a counterspell to break the loop, freeing the children from their temporal prison. At a museum, they found the exhibits shifting through different time periods, showcasing artifacts from ancient civilizations alongside futuristic technology. They had to navigate the chaotic environment and retrieve a fragment of the clock before it caused a temporal paradox. During their quest, Laura began to develop a greater understanding of time magic. She learned how to sense temporal energy, how to manipulate the flow of time, and how to create temporal shields to protect herself from harm. She was essentially becoming a chronomancer one herself. However, with each fragment they retrieved, Laura felt herself growing weaker. The temporal energy was taking a toll on her body, causing her to age prematurely and lose her memories. She realized that she was paying a heavy price for her interference with time. As they gathered the final fragments, Laura and the Guardians discovered that Miles was still alive, albeit in a severely weakened state. He had been transported to a different timeline, where he was being held captive by the Chronomasters. The Chronomasters, it turned out, were not destroyed, but merely scattered across different timelines. They were now seeking revenge on Laura and planned to use Miles as a pawn in their twisted game. They had devised a plan to merge all the time knots into a single massive temporal vortex, which would allow them to rewrite history and create a timeline where they ruled the world. To achieve this, they needed the final fragments of the Cuckoo clock, and they were willing to do anything to get them. Laura knew that she had to confront the Chronomasters one last time, even if it meant facing certain death. The fate of the world depended on it. Laura and the remaining Guardians found themselves in a twisted version of their own city. Buildings morphed between eras, objects duplicated and vanished, and the sky bled with colors that defied human comprehension. They were trapped in a nexus of converging timelines, a direct result of Miles's shattered clock. "The time knots have merged," Eleanor said, her voice grim. "We're on the verge of a dragon break. Reality itself is unraveling." Their immediate goal was to locate Miles and the Chronomasters, but navigating the labyrinth of timelines proved exceedingly difficult. Every street they walked down could shift without warning, leading them to different time periods or alternate realities. They encountered versions of themselves from other timelines. Some were allies, others were enemies. One version of Laura, hardened and cynical, warned them that Miles was beyond saving, and that the only way to restore the timeline was to erase him from existence entirely. Another version of Eleanor, younger and more idealistic, insisted that there was still a chance to redeem Miles and prevent the dragon break. She offered them a device that could stabilize the time knots, but warned that using it would come at a great cost. Laura was torn. She wanted to believe that Miles could be saved, But she also knew that the safety of the world was at stake. She had to make a choice, and she had to make it quickly. As they continued their search, they stumbled upon a hidden Chronomaster's stronghold, a temporal fortress that existed across multiple timelines simultaneously. The fortress was protected by powerful time barriers, making it nearly impenetrable. To breach the fortress, Laura and the Guardians had to master the art of time slipping, a technique that allowed them to briefly phase out of their own timeline and enter another. It was a dangerous maneuver, as any mistake could result in them becoming permanently lost in the time stream. Laura, drawing upon her newfound knowledge of time magic, managed to guide them through the time barriers. They found themselves inside the fortress, facing off against the Chronomasters and their temporal minions. The Chronomasters had transformed Miles into a temporal puppet, using his body as a vessel for their power. He was no longer the man Laura had once loved, but a twisted caricature, spouting cryptic pronouncements and wielding dangerous time magic. "You cannot stop us, Laura," Miles said, his voice distorted and unnatural. "We will rewrite history and create a world where we reign supreme." The Chronomasters unleashed a barrage of temporal attacks, trapping the Guardians in repeating time loops, aging them rapidly and erasing them from existence. Laura fought back with all her might, using her amulet to disrupt their spells and protect her allies. During the battle, Laura came face to face with Miles. She tried to reach out to him, to remind him of the love they once shared. But he was too far gone. The Chronomasters had completely corrupted his mind. "I'm sorry, Laura," Miles said, his eyes momentarily clearing. "But this is the only way." He unleashed a final blast of temporal energy, aimed directly at Laura. She braced herself for the impact, knowing that this could be the end. Just as Miles's blast of temporal energy was about to strike her, a figure leaped in front of Laura, intercepting the attack. It was Eleanor, who had activated a temporal shield at the last moment, sacrificing herself to save Laura's life. The blast ripped through Eleanor's shield, aging her rapidly and turning her into dust before Laura's eyes. With her dying breath, Eleanor whispered, "The paradox. You must prevent the paradox." Laura was devastated by Eleanor's sacrifice, but she knew that she couldn't afford to grieve. She had to honor Eleanor's last wish and prevent the paradox from destroying the timeline. Looking around, she realized the other Guardians were gone, either erased from existence or lost in the chaotic time stream. She was alone, facing Miles and the Chronomasters. She looked at Miles, his face a mask of temporal corruption. He was no longer the man she had loved, but a puppet controlled by the Chronomasters' twisted ambitions. "I'm sorry, Miles," Laura said, her voice filled with sorrow. "But I can't let you do this." She raised her amulet, preparing to unleash a final blast of temporal energy. But before she could act, Miles spoke. "It's too late, Laura," he said, his voice regaining a flicker of its former self. "The paradox is already in motion." He revealed that the Chronomasters' true plan was not to rewrite history, but to create a temporal paradox so massive that it would unravel the entire weave, collapsing all of reality into a single chaotic point. The paradox, he explained, was based on a predestination paradox. The Chronomasters had sent a message back in time, instructing a younger version of Miles to begin experimenting with chronomancy. This message was the cause of his actions, but it only existed because of his actions. It was a closed loop, a self-fulfilling prophecy that threatened to destroy everything. To prevent the paradox, Laura had to travel back in time and stop the younger Miles from receiving the message, but doing so would erase the current Miles from existence and potentially alter the timeline in unpredictable ways. It was a terrible choice, but Laura knew that she had no other option. She activated the time-slipping device she had acquired from the other version of Eleanor and prepared to travel back in time. As she stepped into the time stream, she felt her body being torn apart and reassembled. The past, present, and future swirled around her, blurring together into a chaotic vortex. She arrived in the past, At the moment when the younger Miles was about to receive the message from the Chronomasters, she confronted him, telling him everything that was going to happen and begging him to stop. The younger Miles was skeptical at first, but Laura showed him proof: the digital tattoo on her wrist, the shattered pieces of the Cuckoo clock, and the memories of their shared past. Convinced, the younger Miles agreed to destroy the message and abandon his experiments with chronomancy. As he did so, Laura felt a jolt of energy surge through her body. The timeline was being corrected, but the paradox was not fully resolved. The act of traveling back in time had created a new temporal anomaly, a ripple in the weave that threatened to destabilize the timeline. To fix it, Laura had to make one final sacrifice. She had to erase herself from existence, ensuring that she would never travel back in time and create the paradox in the first place. With a heavy heart, Laura prepared to erase herself from the timeline. She said goodbye to the younger Miles, knowing that he would never remember her. As she faded from existence, she felt a sense of peace. She had saved the world, even if it meant sacrificing herself. Laura awoke in a world that was both familiar and alien. The city was the same, but subtly different. Buildings stood where parks had been, and people she knew were now strangers. The air hummed with a strange energy, a residual echo of the temporal disruptions. She quickly realized that by preventing Miles from experimenting with chronomancy, she had altered the timeline in profound ways. The dragon break had been averted, but the world had paid a price. The search results have made it clear that magic always has consequences. The younger Miles, now an ordinary clockmaker, had no memory of her. He was a kind and gentle man, but he lacked the spark of ambition that had driven his older self to explore the forbidden arts. The Chronomasters were gone, their influence erased from history. But their absence had created a power vacuum, allowing other, even more dangerous forces to rise. A totalitarian regime now controlled the city, using advanced technology to monitor and manipulate its citizens. They were obsessed with order and control, suppressing any form of creativity or individuality. Laura discovered that the totalitarian regime had risen to power because the younger Miles had never discovered chronomancy. His research had inadvertently led to the development of technologies that could control and manipulate time. Without his intervention, these technologies had fallen into the wrong hands. Haunted by the unintended consequences of her actions, Laura resolved to set things right. She would find a way to restore the balance to the timeline, even if it meant sacrificing herself once again. She sought out the remaining guardians, hoping to enlist their help. But they were scattered and weakened, their knowledge of time magic diminished by the altered timeline. One guardian, an elderly woman named Sarah, told her that the only way to restore the timeline was to find the shattered pieces of the Cuckoo clock and reassemble them. The clock, she explained, was a key to unlocking the memories of the old timeline and restoring its balance. The search for the clock fragments led Laura on a perilous journey through the dystopian city. She had to evade the watchful eyes of the totalitarian regime, navigate the treacherous temporal anomalies, and confront the dangerous forces that now controlled the world. Along the way, she encountered echoes of her past life, fragments of memories that had somehow survived the timeline alteration. These memories served as a guide, leading her closer to the clock fragments and reminding her of what she had lost. She learned that the totalitarian regime was using the clock fragments to power their control technologies. By harnessing the temporal energy, they could manipulate the flow of time, erasing dissidents from existence and rewriting history to suit their needs. Laura knew that she had to stop them, even if it meant facing certain death. The fate of the world depended on it. She infiltrated the regime's headquarters, a towering skyscraper that dominated the city skyline. Inside, she found the clock fragments being used to power a massive temporal device, capable of rewriting the entire timeline. As she approached the device, she was confronted by the leader of the totalitarian regime, a ruthless dictator named Valerius. He was a former scientist who had once worked with the younger Miles, but had since become corrupted by power. "You cannot stop me, Laura," Valerius said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. I am creating a perfect world. A world where there is no chaos, no conflict, and no individuality. You're destroying everything that makes life worth living, Laura replied, her voice filled with defiance. Sacrifices must be made for the greater good, Valerius said. He unleashed the power of the temporal device, attempting to erase Laura from existence. But Laura, drawing upon her knowledge of time magic, managed to resist the attack. Laura parried Valerius's temporal attack, channeling the residual energy from her shattered past into a protective shield. The force of the blast shattered windows and buckled steel, but Laura stood firm, fueled by her determination to restore the timeline. You can't win, Valerius, she said, her voice echoing through the shattered chamber. The past is not yours to control. The past is a weapon, Laura, Valerius retorted, and I am its master. He unleashed a barrage of temporal paradoxes, attempting to rewrite Laura's history and erase her from existence. Visions of alternate lives flashed before her eyes. Lives where she had never met Miles. Lives where she had become a ruthless dictator herself. Lives where the world had been plunged into eternal chaos. Laura fought back, using her knowledge of time magic to unravel the paradoxes and maintain her grip on reality. She realized that the only way to defeat Valerius was to destroy the temporal device and sever his connection to the past. She charged towards Valerius, dodging his temporal attacks and weaving through the chaos. He summoned temporal guardians, echoes of past tyrants and dictators, to defend him, but Laura fought them off with ease, her skills honed by countless battles across the time stream. As she neared Valerius, she saw a glimpse of the man he once was, a brilliant scientist driven by a desire to improve the world. But that man was long gone, consumed by power and ambition. I'm sorry, Valerius, Laura said, her voice filled with regret. But this has to end. She unleashed a final blast of temporal energy, aimed directly at the temporal device. The device shattered into 1,000,000 pieces, its temporal energy dissipating into the air. With the device destroyed, Valerius's connection to the past was severed. He aged rapidly, his body withering and his power fading. No, this can't be happening, he gasped, his voice barely audible. He collapsed to the ground, his eyes filled with despair. As he died, the totalitarian regime began to crumble, its control over the city weakening. With Valerius defeated, Laura knew that she had accomplished her mission. She had saved the world from the totalitarian regime and restored the balance to the timeline. But her victory came at a price. The effort of fighting Valerius had drained her of her remaining temporal energy, leaving her weak and vulnerable. She knew that she couldn't stay in this altered timeline. Her presence was a paradox, a ripple in the weave that threatened to destabilize reality. She had to return to her own time, to the world where she belonged. But doing so would mean leaving behind everything she had fought for, everything she had lost. With a heavy heart, Laura prepared to leave. She said goodbye to the younger Miles, knowing that he would never remember her. She said goodbye to Sarah and the remaining guardians, thanking them for their help and guidance. As she stepped into the time stream one last time, she felt a sense of closure. She had saved the world, not once, but twice. She had faced her demons and emerged victorious. But as she journeyed back to her own time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had sacrificed so much to restore the timeline, but what had she gained in return? Laura awoke in her own apartment. The cuckoo clock was gone. The city outside her window was as she remembered it. The timeline had been restored, but something felt different. The vibrant energy she once felt was muted, replaced by a quiet emptiness. The digital tattoo on her wrist had vanished, but the echoes of altered timelines resonated within her. She remembered faces, battles, and sacrifices from realities that no longer existed. Life returned to normal. She went back to her job, reconnected with friends, and tried to forget the horrors she had witnessed. The city was safe. The world was stable. but Laura was haunted by the memories of what had been lost. One day, while browsing an antique shop on Baker Street, she saw a familiar object, a silver spoon engraved with Semiramis 1921. A jolt of recognition ran through her, stirring a faint echo of the past. The shopkeeper, an old woman with knowing eyes, smiled knowingly. "That piece has a story to tell," she said, her voice soft, "but only those who listen closely can hear it." Laura bought the spoon, drawn to it by an irresistible force. Back in her apartment, she held the spoon in her hand, closing her eyes and focusing her mind. A vision flooded her senses. Miles, standing before the telescope at the abandoned observatory, his face filled with hope and ambition. She saw the chronomasters, their faces twisted with greed and power. She saw Eleanor, sacrificing herself to save her life. She saw herself, fighting to protect the timeline, making impossible choices and paying a terrible price. The vision faded, leaving her with a profound sense of loss. She had saved the world, but she had lost so much in the process. She placed the spoon on her mantelpiece, a silent reminder of the sacrifices she had made and the worlds she had saved. It was a reminder that even in a restored timeline, echoes of the past could still be heard, whispering tales of heroism and loss. Years passed. Laura lived a long and fulfilling life, finding happiness and purpose in her work and her relationships, but she never forgot the lessons she had learned during her journey through time. She became a guardian of the timeline in her own way, watching for signs of temporal disturbances and protecting the world from those who would seek to manipulate the past. And every year, on the anniversary of her encounter with Miles, she would visit the abandoned observatory, standing beneath the stars and remembering the night when she had saved the world. The story of Laura and the cuckoo clock became a legend, whispered among the few who knew the truth about time magic.